Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, depending on where you are based. I just saw on the list that we have a very large crowd today on this Colombia webinar, and that's very exciting. I'm Sylvain Newton. I work as a senior advisor for the Chief HR Officer of Allianz, the insurance company, and I have the pleasure as well to be an advisor for the Executive Education Department of Colombia. Today we have an exciting webinar ahead of us, which is called Fostering Your Organization Learning Culture. And this webinar will go through an interesting model exploring human interaction. And to do that, we are going to hear from Dr. Terence Malbia, who is an associate professor at the Teacher College of Columbia. And it's going to be particularly exciting because Terry's expertise is around diversity, strategic learning, and executive coaching. And those three topics together are really focused about organizational learning, about people interaction, and those two driving performance in your organization. So Terry will go over a model that explores particularly the individual, but as well the interpersonal and the organizational level of human interaction, what he called the EQ, SQ, and CQ. Terry will be as well a guest lecturer in our program, our executive education program we will have in November in Colombia, which is titled Powering Organizational and Individual Performance, and we'll be specifically looking at how we leverage neuroscience in executive learning. So I think today is a fantastic teaser, if you want, in terms of the content that Terry will be covering, but definitely a great opportunity for you to be exposed to Terry's thinking. You have the platform in front of you. You see the slides that Terry will be covering, and you will have the opportunity at any time to use the little chat system you see below the slide to ask questions or to put comments. And Terry will leverage that as he speaks to make the whole discussion a little bit more interactive. And what we will do as well toward the end, if we have a little bit time left, we will do a Q&A session. But please just jump in and ask your question as Terry goes. That will create some interaction in the call. So Terry, I'm very excited to have you today with us. It's a privilege, and I'm handing over to you.
Great. And just as you said, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's a pleasure to be online with all of you. And as you mentioned, the topic is really fostering your organization's learning climate. I'm going to really zero in on this notion of human interaction frameworks to enhance talent development. So here we go. Just a little bit about me. You can see the experience. You can read faster than I can speak, so that's great. As you mentioned, I'm a professor here at Teachers College. Before that, I spent 20 years in corporate and sales and marketing, and eventually found my way in leadership, organizational, and talent development, which is where my passion lied. And then I spent some time with a consulting firm before joining the faculty here at Columbia. Went to The Ohio State University, go Bucks, and came to Columbia, got a master's and a doctorate here as well. And so that's just a little bit about me. There are a number of ways and perspectives upon which we can explore the topic of learning and culture. And the way I'm going to do it, just to focus, since we have about 25 minutes together here, is through the perspective of strategic talent management. So that raises the question, when you hear and when you think about strategic talent management, what comes to mind? And so many of you, I hope you can hear, some people said, can we turn up the volume? So if someone can put in the chat feature, yes, so I can hear you, that would be great, so that I know that we are transmitting. And anyone else, if you want to just use the chat feature to say what comes to mind when you hear strategic talent development, that would be great, and I will share some of those comments as well. And thank you for the feedback in terms of being able to hear me. That's wonderful. I'm glad folks can. So what comes to mind when you hear strategic talent management? There's some thoughts. And so I'm going to build on a study that was done by one of my colleagues, Lyle Yorks at Teachers College. He focused it on strategic learning, and Amy Abel. They did a study in 2014 that really brought talent management to an integrated whole by combining things heretofore that had been relatively separate functions in organizations. Human resources, from staffing on the front end to comp and benefits, to labor, to employee relations, learning and development, from technical training to leadership development, and organizational development, design, change, and more large-scale interventions. Their research, where they interviewed and conducted surveys with chief talent officers in organizations, reveals that there are 3 competencies that are important to take on this integrated form of work. And as you can see in the slides, one is strategic thinking, another is results-driven focus, and importantly, this notion of building connections. And I think that links to our topic today, which is human interactions. And the assumption being that the quality of our conversations influence the quality of our relationships, and by extension, the quality of the results and outcomes that we experience. And so throughout the balance of this webinar, we're going to bring some of those ideas together. And so in terms of objectives for the session, I want you to be in a position to name 4 forms of data that really influence high-impact human interactions. What does it look like in action, to be really practical? When we talk about organizational culture in general and learning culture in particular, it's important to really make distinctions between culture and climate. So we'll do that and put you in a position to be able to make that description. And hopefully you'll walk away with some insights that you could then apply to your talent development or current initiatives in your organization. So I hope that's a useful way of thinking it. And it seems like Donovan says aligning recruitment, development, and innovation toward a changing horizon. That's a great definition. So thank you for sharing. When we think about culture, again, very quickly, leaders come to mind, leaders in general and senior leaders in particular, because in many ways leaders are chief architects of organizational culture. And we've been working around with this framework that says in order to focus on the quality of the conversations and relationships, we have to think about leadership beyond IQ. So it's not that cognitive intelligence is not important, but it's necessary but not sufficient to building these high-performance, high-engagement climates. So we've been thinking about this notion of integrated leadership that, in addition to IQ or cognitive intelligence, includes emotional intelligence, asking ourselves questions like, what do I stand for? What are my strengths? What are opportunities for growth? And this is really leading self. And this is drawing on the work that has been made popular by emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman and others. That's individual level work. Another layer of this leadership notion is to think about interpersonal dynamics. We call this social intelligence, leading others. And so what do we stand for? What are our core values? And how do we interact? So you see this notion of interaction coming into play, social intelligence. So we go from the individual to interpersonal teams and groups. And importantly, that strategic level, the questions that say, what are our aspirations? What is it that we're trying to create together? How will we win in the marketplace, or toward providing a product or service to our strategic stakeholders or our key stakeholders? So this framework, in addition to thinking about leadership beyond cognitive intelligence, focuses on emotions. We call that inside-out work. The social interactions or outside-in work, and brings together that sort of systematic work. And so when we think about integrated talent development, we can think about it at 3 levels of the system: individual, groups, and organizations and structures. So one quick framework, if a couple of people would either have some questions about that and or observations, feel free to fire those away in the chat feature. Otherwise, I will continue. So we'll build on that. I see some people still sharing ideas about what talent management means to them, identifying and developing high performers aligned to the business, learning paths, absolutely. And so when we look at that broad definition of talent management, another layer to that is to say, when we think about leading talent management, strategic talent management, what are the layers or levels of work? And again, going beyond cognitive intelligence, emotional, social, and we can call this last strategic CQ, or cultural intelligence, systems level. So let's continue. So when we think about building and fostering learning cultures, we're really wanting to make a key distinction between culture and climate. And so we asked ourselves the question, what's the difference between organizational culture and workplace climate? So I ask you to give that some thought for a moment. And one way of thinking about that is culture, simply define organizational culture as the way we do things around here. And so it tends to really zero on if I'm thinking about where I'm meeting my clients or key stakeholders. And when we talk about organizational climate or culture, I'm tending to meet them sort of at the higher levels of the organization or more senior levels. When we think about workplace climate, we can respond to that by what does it feel like to work around here? So how do we do things around here, organizational culture, and what does it feel like to work around here? And so when I think about organizational culture, and there definitely is a connection to learning and talent development, it says that what is the learning that needs to take place with respect to leadership in the organization, the external environment, mission, strategy, vision, and the like. So really high-level focus in terms of the learning. When we think about workplace climate, that is, what does it feel like to work in this part of the organization? So supervisors and managers are really focused on this element of the organization. How do we translate organizational culture to management practices, structure, systems, motivation, task requirements for the work that needs to get done, individual needs and values, and all of that collectively has an impact. So another framework that says what is strategic talent development, and importantly, what is integrative leadership, going beyond cognitive intelligence to include emotional, individual, leading self, groups and teams, social intelligence, and cultural intelligence, really thinking about the system. So another framework. And then ultimately, when we think about the difference between individuals or independent actors and organizations, so whether it's a nonprofit or a multi-billion-dollar corporation, at the end of the day, it's really about performance. And how can fostering a learning culture really contribute to performance at the individual, team, group, and organizational level? And so that also raises the question, what do we mean by performance? What comes to mind? So give you a moment to sort of think about that in the mind's eye. And for me, I like simple equations. And so performance is really about behavior and results. And so we asked ourselves the question, what are the behaviors? What motivates individuals? How do we tap into individual and groups' commitment to drive behavior? How do we ensure that the performance outcomes are clear, so clarity, competence, do they have the skills, knowledge, and personal attributes? So there's a lot that goes into behavior, and importantly, what about conditions? What about the things that are really outside of the individual's control? And so when we then think about this notion of strategic talent management, we think about looking at strategic talent management in terms of fostering a learning culture at multiple levels, individual, drawing on IQ and EQ, at the group and interpersonal and team level, social intelligence, and at the more system level, cultural intelligence, and then on saying what's the connection to performance, we're looking at the behaviors of individuals, the behavior of teams, and looking at the behavior of the organization and how that contributes to results. So another framework. So that then moves us to, well then, in general, how do we measure performance? So there are quantitative measures, which in general and simply defined as we want to increase or decrease something. We want to increase sales, profits, market share, productivity, things like that, or decrease things like costs, errors, complaints, and so on. So I'm always asking when we're coaching or engaged in a training intervention, what are the sort of quantitative metrics that are associated with learning and development? What are the qualitative metrics, which is really about product service expectations of effectiveness? So quantity is about increasing and decreasing, and quality is about how well do we do it. time metrics are important as well, duration, cycle time, response rates, and the like. And then, importantly, resource metrics. That is, what's the investment in people, equipment, and other things that relate to operational and budget. So when we sort of pull all that together and look at performance, we're really looking at the collective impact of quantity metrics, quality metrics, time metrics, and resource metrics. So those are some additional frameworks. All comes together at the different levels. And why is all this important? Framing, perspective taking, and performance. The human interaction framework that I'm going to introduce, and then take me about 5 minutes to do that, and we'll have plenty of time for questions, about 10, is based on this flow, that our worldview or our mental models, that is the lens through which we see and act in the world, is really influenced by a combination of who we are, person variables, and the environment that we operate in. But it's also true that our worldview actually influences the data that we can take in. And by extension, what we pay attention to, and therefore what we filter out, and therefore, by definition, what the data that we take in, and importantly what we don't pay attention to, influences the options that we have at our disposal and our action strategies, and in fact, the outcomes that we desire and the outcomes that we experience. And so oftentimes we don't really pay attention to the filtering effect that's really taking place between our worldview and the data that's available. And we're really just thinking more about our views and the options and the outcome. And so this framework really highlights the importance of mindset. And so we're beginning to learn from the cognitive, social, and behavioral neurosciences that there's a brain and mind and performance connection between worldview and actions. And marketing has figured this out a long time ago, and we in the social sciences are starting to leverage this work now as well. So the other two big ideas that I would like to share in our time together is that when we think about the anatomy of a productive conversation or human interactions, they have a beginning, middle, and end. Nothing too shocking about that. And we get really clear about what's the purpose of this interaction, what's the benefit to the key parties that are involved, making sure there's alignment between purposes and benefits, and then we have an opening move. The framework that I'm going to share with you, the very last one that really talks about human interaction, is what are the various forms of data, objective, reflective, interpretive, and decisional, that are actually happening during these interactions. And based on our style and preferences, which forms of data do we naturally or are we personally inclined to focus on, and importantly, which are the ones that we may filter out? And therefore that would have an impact. Knowing that awareness is important because it can have an impact. And then how do we close conversations? And so here's the real big idea that I wanted to get to. This comes from, it's called the Oort Framework. It's a great dialogue framework. It comes from the art form method. And it basically says when people come to our coaching program, one of the things they want is, I want to learn how to ask great questions. Then you give them this list of questions and their eyes glaze over. Again, I like simple frameworks, and so if you can take the universe of questions and organize them around 4 broad questions, all of which have many derivatives, that would be wonderful. And so if you think about this framework, it goes like this. Each of them has a meta question, and once you understand the meta question, you can go deeper. And so there we can start with objective data. The meta question is what's happening. That's really external to the person, so it's relatively direct observable data. We could call that external context. There's reflective data. Kind of the meta question is, how is what's going on in the external environment landing on me personally? So what are my sort of reactions? How am I feeling or reacting to this? And so when we think about any form of performance or workplace context, there's always this interplay between the external data, objective data, and our internal response to that. The interesting thing about the internal response is it happens in a metasecond or a nanosecond, and it's actually going on beyond the threshold of consciousness. Moving on, there's interpretive data. Ultimately, a pattern resides, or reveals itself, and that's interpretive data. The meta question there is, given what's going on in the external environment and our internal reaction to it, what meaning am I ascribing to that? That is, what patterns am I noticing, what themes, what trends, and ultimately what am I learning? And then the last element is decisional data, and the meta question there is, what do I do? How do I respond? The reason why this framework works is because it lines up with the way we learn from and through experience. A couple of points here. It doesn't matter where we start. If we want to engage in whole person interaction, we need to get through the cycle. And a couple of things to point out. One is it's easier to go to the adjacents. So if I asked for objective data, what brings you here today? So I'm asking for some situational factors. And the person starts talking to me about they've been thinking about what's it all about lately, which is more of a meaning question. I know that they're at a different stage of the learning process than I am. So I don't slap them and say, no, 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 I want to hear facts. I don't want to hear about the meaning you're making. I join them there and ask them to say more about it and then listen for their internal experience and the decisions they're making given what they're thinking about, and then can ask them what's the trigger. So this Oort data, objective, reflective, interpretive, and decisional, can actually help us not only ask very focused questions at multiple levels, so you can see what the lead questions are, you can see what the descriptions are for each, and by the way, I don't know how we can do this, or even if it's possible, because it looks like there's 60 people on the call. But if people are interested in this slide deck, my information is at the very end, so I'll make sure that slide stays up for a period of time, and either through the business school here or my own devices, I can make sure that you get a copy of these slides. But linking this to brain science, this is a very simplistic view of the brain, but if we look at the sort of concrete experience, sort of the sensory cortex, we begin to see that's where objective data resides. Sort of reflective data is residing in this framework. The more interpretive data is residing in this framework, and the action or decisional data is residing in this framework. And so when we think about culture and we think about whole person engagement, and just going back to the Oort framework for a moment, if you want headlines, objective data is really about rationality. Reflective data is really about motivation and values. Interpretive data, meaning, is really about the zone of what I call the zone of creation. And then decisional data is really the zone of action. So if you go back to this notion of talent development, talent management, and whole person engagement, being able to pay attention to the full range of data, objective, reflective, interpretive, and decisional, in a strategic way at the individual, group, and organizational level, can actually help individuals, teams, and organizations achieve the results they desire. And so with that, I am going to pause and allow questions, comments, observations. Would love to hear from some of you, and I can go back to any of the slides as you see fit. So we have time for questions. Fire away, and/or observations. What speaks to you? What do you find useful? What do you have questions about? It's actually exciting to see there's about 59 of you on the call today. I have to pull down my elevator so I can see. Yes, please. Would you copy the slides? I'll do that. So you'll see so let me pull up that slide so people can see it. So there is my email address. So if you two things. If there's a way for you to type your name and email address into the chat feature, that's one way we may be able to get it to you. If that doesn't work, then just simply send me an email, and I'll fire out a PDF of the slides for you. Or if there's a way, and I'm not sure here, but someone on the Columbia side, if there's a way to put them to a link and I can put the slides on the Columbia website, we can do that. But we'll find a way to get them to you. Is there a suggestion here that ORIT applies to the whole person learning through more executive ed channels than coaching? Actually, it's really not. The Oort Framework, we apply the Oort Framework in the coaching program, but the Oort Framework actually goes broader than that. So I can think about Oort from an interpersonal perspective, which could be coaching. I could actually think of Oort as a reflection tool, which doesn't even require coaching. It could be individual reflection via learning journals, for example. I can think about Oort at the group level to help groups and teams facilitate strategic conversations that capture the whole engagement. So another way of looking at ORIT, if you think about the objective and decisional data, that's more left brain. If you think about reflective and interpretive, that's more right brain. And some of it is more cerebral and some of it's more limbic. So the reason why I started with the cognitive intelligence, emotional, social, and cultural is that you can apply ORIT, strategic talent development, at the individual, interpersonal, group, and organizational level. In the coaching program, we focus specifically on the interpersonal dynamic. That is how coaches can actually apply ORIT as a questioning listening structure. I hope that helps. Other questions and comments? Let me see. Another one is, they're coming fast and furious. I would like a PDF. That's not a question. Let me keep going here. More slides. When we want to make organizational changes, where do we start? Do we start at the individual, group, organizational level? That's a great question. And so much of it depends on what's the trigger for the work or the intervention. I am increasingly of the belief that teams and groups actually are the bridge between individual performance and organizational performance. And so even when the target is organizational change, I think one of the research is very clear on this, that a large percentage of large-scale change initiatives fail, and I think one of the reasons is that we're not strategically working individual, i.e. coaching and learning interventions, team and group level, i.e. Facilitated processes, and organizations working on systems and structures, making sure that the systems and structures align with group work, which align with individual capacities and development. So I think when you want to engage in individual or organizational change, you have to work all three levels, and that's why thinking about emotional, social, and cultural intelligence is helpful for me, so that I can know what's the focus of my intervention. So if I'm working on the organization, that's really talking about culture. If I'm working on teams and groups, that's really at the social level. If I'm working on individuals, that's really IQ and EQ. So I hope that helps. Some other questions. Love copy, blah, 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 love copy. Do you think that any one of the impact metrics are more important or critical metrics than the other? Going back to the metrics slide that talked about, so in my mind, when we think about measurement, we want, just like ORIT allows us to engage in whole person engagement, objective, reflective, interpretive, and decisional, I think in terms of metrics, we want to look at quantitative and qualitative metrics, right? Because if we think about quantitative, that's kind of outside in, objective work. Quality metrics are more about reflective data, right? So if you see now there's a linkage between measurement and ORIT and actually how people learn, resources and time. And so I think impact metrics in my mind represent the collective impact or the collective summation of quantitative metrics, qualitative metrics, time metrics, and resource metrics. So it's more like a dashboard, a measurement dashboard. And so whether I'm coaching an individual or whether I'm working with a team, whether I'm working on an organization, I always ask them, what's the dream, what's the desired outcome, the desired result? And let's talk about that from the perspective of quantitative, qualitative, time, duration, and resources, needed resources, people, and equipment, resources, etc. So I hope that answers that. And I see that we are approaching the hour. It says, what are some development practices are suggested to foster a learning climate? Great question, and I would be happy to stay on for a few more minutes. And I think what I'll do, since we are at the hour and there's a number of wonderful questions, again, if there's a way, and I'm sure there is, that we can post something on the Columbia Executive Ed website, I'll take a look at these questions either afterwards or after the session or after the workshop or before, and really start providing some responses and thinking. Because I'm looking at the list here, and there are a lot of wonderful questions, many of which I can't answer now that we're over a minute. So any parting words for my colleagues there?
Yeah, that would be great. And Terry, I think another option for people to get answers to their question to you is really to join the program we will have in November, because you will be one of the key guest lecturers there, the program which will be focusing on leveraging neuroscience. And I think today you showed us a great way of how research insight can be transferred into model that we then as practitioners can leverage to drive performance in our organization. And I think you've done that in a very elegant and very powerful way. So lots of questions came out. But guess what? 2 days would be wonderful to spend more time with you, ask you more questions, debate with other practitioners, and then bring back answers to our organization to drive performance. You will be joined there by Eric Kandel, who is a Nobel Prize winner, as well faculty at Columbia, as well as Heidi Alvorsen, who is a Thinker 50 Leadership Award, so wonderful faculty. So I would enjoy if anybody on the phone today would join us and continue the discussion with you, Terry. But thank you, that was terrific today.
I hope people can pick up from that conversation that I really do have a passion for the interplay between evidence-based practice, i.e. research, but also translating it and working to make it practical. So thank you. Thanks all 45 of you for joining us. Actually, at one point, I think at the peak, we had over 50. So thanks you for joining the webinar today. And I think with that, we are ready to sign off.